Good afternoon and thanks for having me here. So I will talk today about work we conduct right now in Tübingen and in Leuven. And these are my collaborators, Stéphane Parmentier, Chris van Spaun and Marta Valinias. Okay.
It might be a little focused.
Yeah. And when we came to this field, I was coming more from the area of criminology and my colleagues were coming from the sociology of law. We found out that there's a lot of people looking into issues of post-conflict situations in states. They are coming from the sociology of law approach and political science, and they don't know anything about restorative justice or criminology. And me coming from criminology, not knowing very much about what those people in transitional justice have done. So what we identified were four very important areas which you have to deal with after conflicts in societies. Truth is the first, then you have to deal with accountability, reparation, and reconciliation. And recently I spent a lot of time in countries of former Yugoslavia, and they make a mistake. They always want to start here. And I keep telling them you have to start here with truth, accountability, reparations, then you can talk about reconciliation. But they want to jump to the end, and therefore they fail miserably, usually, in those countries. Because they talk about, all the time they talk about truth and reconciliation commissions in former Yugoslavia, and maybe some of you know, they started one in Serbia, which already closed down, it failed completely. They still hope they will get one off in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but it has to be seen. But as I said, the mistake is that they start here. They want to reconcile, and I think they have to start here and go this way. So those are four areas which we identify to be very important. And so also that the traditional responses to justice were very retributive, and therefore we try to explore new avenues. This research is based on projects. One we run in South Africa, where we focus our attention on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and one in the Balkans, which we just started now. So if you take our model, then you have here the international dimension, the national dimension, and here you have non-judicial responsive like truth commissions, and here you have there's talk about establishing an international truth commission for all sorts of conflict, but it is a long way to go. And here you have then judicial responses like the ICTY, as in The Hague, or the ICTR, and now recently the ICC, which was established. Unfortunately, the ICC is not joined by the US.
International Criminal Court.
Yeah, which was established in The Hague. One problem with the ICC is that somebody say we first need an international police, criminal police, before we should have an international criminal court. Because what good is a court who has no power whatsoever to enforce, to catch war criminals? Like that's a problem which happened in the former Yugoslavia, where they still have two of the most wanted war criminals running around in former Yugoslavia, and the ICTY is not able to get them because they don't have police forces to do so. So there you see already some of the problems. So the old traditional way was focus on punishment, and they usually looked at the selective group of perpetrators, and they paid little to the conflict causes. So that's why we think restorative justice might be the right answer. And also they were based on Western intervention models. They are top-down, they have a short-term vision, and they based on Western values, which usually don't work in these countries we are talking about usually.
Which values would you be referring to?
Oh, what we think, what democracy is, and what elections are, what good police work is, etc., etc. So what are the arguments for restorative justice? They focus on victims, they look at the underlying problems, They are culture sensitive, which is very important. They are cohesion oriented, but be aware they do not exclude some form of coercion. That's a critical point in all of what we talk about restorative justice. Can we use coercion or not, or in our cases military interventions or not, and I will come to it later. We basically use two definitions of restorative justice. One is process-oriented by Tony Marshall, and one is goal-oriented, which is the one offered by Gordon Bazemore and Lode Walgrave. I have them even here if you want to read them. Here you can see Marshall's is process-oriented, whereas Bazemore, Gordon's, and Lode's is doing justice by repairing the harm that has been caused by the crime. They are quite useful for this kind of work. So what do you need to do if you use restorative justice principles in the aftermath of mass victimization? They focus on personalism, participation, repairing harm, and reintegration. The key principles of them are bringing victims and offenders together, focusing on the harm that has been caused by the crime, holding perpetrators responsible for their acts, meeting the needs for victims' redress, promoting the reintegration of both victims and perpetrators, and preventing future harm by building on the strengths of the community and government. Even though this slide says conclusion, I'm far away from the end. This is just, again, our model: truth, accountability, reparation, reconciliation. These are the restorative justice components we identified, which are important.
Could you define them, go in boxes and define the restorative justice components?
Oh, they focus on persons. They personalize the conflict between an offender and a perpetrator. They have both or all parties being involved in the conflict. That takes them part in the process of accountability, bringing victims, offenders together, extended families or secondary victims. And they focus on reparation, which is a bit tricky. I will talk about it a little later. And then, of course, the ultimate goal is reconciliation, and that leads also to reintegration of both offenders, victims, and the community. You're welcome. In our work, we use a model developed by Paul McCold and Ted Wachtel, who identified direct stakeholders and indirect stakeholders. And here you have the victim, the offender, extended families, witnesses, other direct affected immediate family, and then you have other ones which are surrounded. They are indirect stakeholders. So this is for restorative justice, what they identified, and we transferred this to post-conflict situations, where you again have in the middle these direct stakeholders, and then you have all these other ones around it, and all of them are involved in the process of reconciliation or dealing with post-conflict situations, which makes it very tricky, of course. To make it more complicated, this is what Paul and Ted have identified as, they say, this is fully restorative, these ones are partly or mostly restorative, and these are partly restorative. So you have all these different kinds of things. And yeah?
What does the Church of Reconciliation model fit into this?
I'll come to it in a minute.
Would you focus a little bit, I think, maybe,
Oh, on this, here they identified as truly...
No, the legs.
That's just a function of my eyesight, but seems to be going out there.
Yeah, it's getting worse.
You have a great for lunch. No, but there could be other variables.
We transferred that model also to post-conflict situations, and you can see here in the middle we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I've had one more. The Bougainville model I will explain in a minute. Here you have Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. So far you have worldwide, we had 30 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, started mainly in Central and South America, and you had even one here, you have one in the US in North Carolina in one community. Then we have Gacaca tribunals as in Rwanda, where they had 13,000 people in pre-trial detention custody, and they needed to release those people. They were in there for years, and then they went back to the traditional Gacaca tribunals, held in the communities where they bring together the families of victims and offenders and try to rebuild communities. Then here you have community peace projects. They were introduced in South Africa by Clifford Shearing and John Cartwright. What they do is they have two avenues. One is peacemaking and one is peace building. And the first one is that they bring into very disoriented slum areas, they appoint and elect peacemakers who handle the conflicts in the community. And they get paid for their work, so they have an interest, and they also can make money with this. And for every case they solve successfully, the community gets money for peace building. It's a very successful model, and they have handled so far in South Africa 15,000 cases with these community peace projects. It's a very interesting approach. I sat in some of the peace projects hearings this summer, and it was very interesting how they did it. And I said I have a fifth one we identified. Those are the Healing Through Remembering projects in Northern Ireland, where they brought together also community people, victims, offenders, and they talk about what they experiences, and that leads to a healing process in Northern Ireland. Very interesting approach. I think the healing process through Remembering project is the appropriate one for the Balkans, because Truth and Reconciliation Commissions seem not to work there because they have so many cultural backgrounds and different ideas and histories in the Balkans, so you need to go more regional. You cannot have a wholly approach for the whole country. And I think the Northern Ireland one is a wonderful thing to introduce in the Balkans. Here I have a very old pyramid by John Braithwaite, developed years ago, where he argues that sometimes we need to be as restorative as possible at the bottom, and as we go up, we might have to go to trials, have to go back to the traditional courts and use coercion if people do not cooperate, who do not want to participate in restorative justice process. But we should offer it at all stages. That's his argument. He tried also to develop a pyramid for conflicts, and this is from his latest book, Restorative Justice and Responsive Regulation, which came out in 2002. And I think there's a basic flaw in his model, because he thinks there's something at the bottom which is called restorative peacemaking, and I think that is not existing in reality. So he shouldn't even start with this one. He builds it up on the United Nations work that we should use, let's say, for dictatorships or countries where conflicts, civil wars exist, Security Council warnings, economic sanctions, comprehensive sanctions, and then if nothing works, we have to use a military intervention. If you take the United Nations concept away from this pyramid, you can call it the B&B model, which is a Bush-Blair model, as applied in Iraq. But I think the basic mistake lies in that he thinks there's something at the basis which is restorative. I don't think it's existing. And there comes in the Bougainville model. Bougainville is a small island in Papua New Guinea which had a 20-year-old civil war, and after 20 years the Australian government got impatient and felt responsible, and they sent in 2,000 troops to restore peace on the island. And then they brought in peacemakers, and the peacemakers, they trained some 30,000 peace builders. And these peace builders went through every community, in every village, and they had reconciliation meetings in these villages. And what we learned from them, very interesting, is they argued that every village was different. You could not go from one village and apply it and then go to the next one. Everyone had different cultures, different values, so you had to take into account all of them, and that led to a restorative peacemaking process. And I think it's more a top-down, not bottom-up approach what they use. Also, what we learned from Bougainville was, and that was the big mistake they made in South Africa, is when, as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, they promised monetary compensation to the people who participated in the process in South Africa. And the state is bankrupt, and the state cannot pay those money, what they promised. And therefore, a lot of people are very unhappy in South Africa about the outcome of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. In Bougainville, interesting, they offered also monetary compensation, but the villagers said, that's blood money, we don't take it. Go away with your money. Money is very destructive, we don't need it. So it was against their cultures and against their values, so they refused to take monetary compensation, and I think that's one of the things we have to reconsider, whether we really need to pay people money in order to compensate for harms they have suffered from. So that's some of the lessons from Bougainville. And then from these two models we developed this one, where we argue this one can work for dictatorship countries or countries who have civil conflicts, where you use the UN, and of course you see here there's room for more steps which we have to identify. We are far away from being complete. This is the Bougainville model put up on it, where you start with the military intervention, then you bring in peacemakers. Then I learned from practitioners that you need trauma work before you can start a process of reconciliation, something we overlooked before. And I think there are many other things which you have to identify, which you have to bring into these models. And that's the end of my story. Thank you very much.
I'm sure there'll be many questions. Maybe somebody could turn the lights on?
Yeah, oops.
Maybe we'll open up the floor to questions at this point.
Yeah.
Yes. Cynthia? Elmar?
Yeah.
Question in terms of how you feel about the differences between ICCR and the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Rwanda, and which do you see have been effective in terms of bringing some kind of both the idea of healing to that country as well as some aspect of justice?
Well, the ICTR was so far not very successful, as you might well know, because they haven't brought many people to justice. And some people argue that we need mixed tribunals, like inside the country. One of the problems is, of course, that they put the ICTR in The Hague, so they have to bring everybody, offenders, victims, witnesses, to The Hague, and so which is very problematic. And many people argue we should have such tribunals inside the countries, in Rwanda, and I agree with them. That's being done right now in Sierra Leone, where they have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and at the same time they have trials in Sierra Leone. So some people favor those ones. Some people say Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as in South Africa, works the best, and some people say the tribunals are even more successful. So I think a mixed, balanced approach would be the best. And I mentioned before Gacaca trials. That was a result because they imprisoned so many people in Rwanda who were all involved in these atrocities, and then they had no way to judicially handle it, and that's why they had to go back to the Gacaca trials, which was very much ingrained in their cultural background in Rwanda. But it's very hard to say which works best, and there's lots of work is being done there. And these are just some models we play around with, and we look into what might work, and that's the work we are engaging in right now. Yes?
Just seeing how many different variations there are on the types of models, from an analytical perspective, is there in measuring success? What does success look like in these models?
It's hard to say. I just met a Serbian guy, a psychologist, who developed a psychological scale and how to measure when people are ready for reconciliation processes. I'm still waiting for him to send me his material, and I'm very eager to look at it. But he developed, and his work is based on interviews with 2,000 victims in former Yugoslavia, where he developed a scale where he argues, or he says he can really measure when people are ready for reconciliation processes. So that would be, of course, a goal. And as you can see, the difference between South Africa and the former Balkan is, in South Africa they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission quite successfully, with the exception that they are not able to pay now compensation. And in the Balkan it's still like everything is up in turmoil. And they are far from getting together or talking about their experiences or establishing processes of how to, because everybody occupies the truth in those countries. If you talk to the Serbs, they have their version, the Croatians have their version, the Bosnians have a different version, and the Afghans in Kosovo, the Albanians in Kosovo have another version. And it's very hard to bring them together, and that's why I think they need to take the Northern Ireland approach and bring the people together and healing through truth-telling. So where you bring them together and they have to tell their stories and they have to agree on it. That's a key principle about it. That's later. I think in the beginning we have to handle what is the truth, what really happened. When you have the truth, then you can talk about who is responsible for the atrocities and what we call accountability. And then you can think about what kind of justice interventions you need, or what kind of justice system, whether it's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, international tribunal. The United Nations doesn't want to engage more in international tribunals because they're extraordinarily expensive. Like the ICTY of former Yugoslavia has now 1,500 people work for it. So I mean, just imagine you have to pay 1,500 salaries a month out of the blue. So it's a lot of sources which goes into it. Or if you want to have like a tribunal in combination with national courts, like that's what they try right now in Serbia, they're establishing now more national courts where they try war criminals within Serbia or within Croatia, within Bosnia, and we don't know what the right answer is, so it's still pretty open.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
You start off your discussion with the kind of intersection between criminological theory, not understanding political theory, and vice versa. How do you reconcile the different units of analysis here, that is nation states or sub-nation categories versus most of criminology, individuals or small groups of individuals? How do you reconcile first the unit of analysis? And then I think the next question is, you seem to have a series of prescriptions that are built into the ways in which these interventions have come about, except that they're all determined culturally. So how do you know which cultural triggers trigger which prescription?
Good question. Starting with
That's why I'm the dean here. Just kidding. We've been friends for a long time. But on the first thing, we all have a conceptual set of issues, criminology versus kind of political theory.
Well, it's where restorative justice comes from. Why is restorative justice so popular these days? Because we are so dissatisfied with the traditional criminal justice system, because they act so poorly. And so the argument of RJ is bring together the people. Like Niels Christie, as he said, give the people back their conflicts. And so that's why I think it's wiser to bring victims, offenders together, and that's why I have no problems with the state. But if it comes down to conflict is taking place between people or in communities. And so that's why you should go back to that level.
But it's typically a subnational level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then the second part of that question, which is the better part of the question, but the second part of the question, which is trying to reconcile the prescriptions in what triggering order versus the cultures, and how do you begin to build a typology of the interaction of those?
Well, as I said, the model is far from being complete, and we are still in the process to identify new ways of what might work in different cultures. Mm-hmm. So we are still fishing out there, looking here, looking there, what works. So what we learn about, like Bougainville, was very interesting. What we could learn from that experiment, what we can learn from Northern Ireland is also very interesting these days. But we don't know. And when I showed this model the first time, then practitioners said, trauma work, where's your trauma work? And I said, I have no idea, what do you mean by it? And they said, well, you have to do extensive trauma work if your model is supposed to work. So that's why we included now trauma work, and I'm sure there are lots of other things. Like we discussed over lunch, what you do with policing, how to re-establish security in civil war countries. Is that so important? I have the impression in many countries and conflicts that we also want to establish immediately a complete criminal justice or justice system in those countries, and forget that you have to do some other things before you can reach those levels. And I think that's why the work of Clifford Shearing and John Cartwright, what they developed in South Africa, is so beautiful, where they first rebuild communities. And when you slowly rebuild communities, then you can think about security, law enforcement, and a judicial system later on, which might fit the needs of the community.
Maybe you could explain to the group how, when the police, if you go to Brazil, or you go to South Africa, or you go to several other places, where the police are the problem. It's not that that they're the solution to the problem; they are the problem. That they account for the largest percentage of homicides in those countries. How do you begin to then rebuild order, moving towards a security, when it's the security that is destabilizing the community order in the first place?
Well, I liked what the United Nations has done in Nicaragua when the Sandinistas took over, and afterwards when the Somoza people came back into power, where they had to restructure the police, and they put together a Sandinista policeman together with a Somoza policeman, and they had to patrol together in order to let them grow together and so on and so on. And I think that might be a valuable approach to that. Or you can do it by a process which was done in former East Germany, a process which we call lustration, meaning we fire all the top-level police and bring in the new ones from the West. I mean...
May not be as culturally sensitive.
No, they were not so happy about it, but it worked.
Well, when you say it worked, on what levels did it work? And both the lower level Sandinista and kind of they've tried black and white police officers in this country for years, and it's a symbolic representation.
Well, it worked in Nicaragua. It worked quite well. At least they reached some consensus, and then they built it up from scratch. But with East Germany, of course, I just told Peter this story about, we found in one state in East Germany, it was reported one day, they had an 800% increase in bank robberies. And when we looked into it, it was from 0 to 8. And so then we explored, why didn't they have bank robberies in former East Germany? And we found out it didn't make any sense to rob a bank because you couldn't buy anything with your money. And that's why the banks had no security systems. And all the 8 bank robbers, by the way, came from West Germany. Yes?
Just to follow up on the point you were making before, I wonder if what you're describing might evolve into something that's less of a model and more of a set of principles. I really like the idea that it's culturally defined by the local culture. But when you start saying that it's a model, then all of a sudden it's prescriptive, and you need to take steps in that way. Whereas if it ends up being a set of principles or a set of standards or something that can be tailored to fit the jurisdictions that you're in.
I think that's a very good point, yeah. I think we should call it principles.
You're awfully easy.
Yes.
Could you perhaps speak a little bit to, you mentioned transitioning democracies and how this is the idea more frequently with this idea of transitioning democracies. Is there something about the transition itself? For example, are more consociational transitions more in tune with this kind of idea? And in your experience, have you seen that kind of influence?
It's hard to say.
It would
Right.
seem that they would fit
Well,
well with like a
even if you look at East Germany as an example, which is 15 years ago when the two Germanys united, and right now 1/5 of both populations in the East and the West want to rebuild the wall. So I think we didn't succeed too much in the transition of those processes. So according to recent polls, 20% in both parts of the country want to rebuild the wall because they think it was much better before.
Is this generational?
No, I don't think so.
Speaking of transitional democracy, I'm more and more inclined to view the United States as one. I'm interested historically, when you mentioned monetary compensation as being a sort of problematic standard mechanism, I'm thinking about reparations, the sort of movement for reparations in this country for slavery and in the succeeding years of legal segregation.
Mm-hmm.
And much of the resistance, I think, in this culture, within many cultures in the United States, has been around this sort of idea that someone's going to get paid. And that it will come out of someone else's purse. No immediate contact. I'm wondering if in the literature and the discussions of reparations, challenges, models, if the United States, if these discussions of reparations are engaged at all, whether the United States or other countries that participated in the transatlantic slave trade, has the reparations study, analysis been extended to that particular case?
No, not that I know of. I mean, it's being discussed sometimes in South Africa. They discuss it to sue now the big companies like Daimler Chrysler because they exploited the workers in South Africa. And they also talk about reparation, and then you know about the war criminals, the slave workers in World War II. They have been compensated mainly by the German companies and the government now. But in terms of when we talk about state compensation schemes, I think the state of Victoria in Australia is a very good example because they had a very old traditional European system that was very complicated to get compensation, and you needed through a long process, and at the end usually you got huge sums of money. And then they changed it completely because they realized we don't reach very many victims. And what they do now is they offer for every victim of a crime gets as a state compensation 12 counseling hours. And the amazing thing is the people love it. And they even have victims who got compensated under the old scheme who call now and they say, I want my counseling sessions. So what that tells us, money is not so important. This counseling service is much more important to people.
And is there a notion of limitations, temporal or otherwise, in the restorative justice framework?
There's not very much discussion on it. One of the few scholars who was writing on it is Chris Canine from the University of Sydney, who looks into the Australian Aboriginal situation. He's dealing with this kind of issues. But in general, there's not much you will find.
I was wondering if you about Bougainville, was that work done? I noticed it reference to Pat Howery. Is that anthropological work, or what was the source of that?
Yeah, that's a book he wrote. It's called Breaking Spears, Mending Hearts. And John Braithwaite has written about it in his latest book.
Oh, has he?
Yeah.
I was just interested in the process. the fundamental problem, contradiction of money, of course, is the grade zero, but at the same time, the metric is inconsistent with the cultural assessment of the character and nature of it. And the totem itself represents Western domination.
Right,
so
right.
It's an interesting point. If you convert the exchange into a gift, as you say, counseling or any form of reciprocity, where you have reciprocity outside the metric of money, you might have a more. It's interesting that it works in South Africa. I mean, very interesting. I don't know that. I mean, I know generally it works, but I didn't know about that.
Well, you find many examples. Like, for instance, in South Africa, I attended like a meeting where the mother of a killed daughter brought the killer of her daughter to the meeting, and they gave a talk about what they went through, both sides. It was very interesting. Simon.
I think restorative justice is a great idea. Getting back to Jack's point, there is so much variation culturally in terms of implementing restorative justice. Culturally, sociologically, in terms of macro structures, and there's many historical examples way before the restorative justice movement that illustrates where it works. Post-war Germany was restorative justice in a sense. Before we had the theory formalized by criminologists, the Nuremberg trials within that field, truth and reconciliation, the victim compensation program that we've spoken about. Is there anything really that new that goes beyond the theory, which is great theory of Christian love in restorative justice, and the problem of implementing that? And part of the problem in implementing is that it can make things a lot worse. And there's good historical examples of that as well.
Yeah.
Religious fervor to restore and tear down the walls and to convert and to agree has been missionary and also very oppressive.
I mean, to start with, that it is so culturally diverse, I think that's one of the strengths of restorative justice.
What's the first part? Say that again.
The cultural diversity of it, I think that's one of the strengths of restorative justice, because you can apply it at in different contexts. I don't consider that as a weakness. And if you go back, and why do people got so fascinated about restorative justice? If you go back in the history of humankind, you find many, many examples in all continents, in all cultures, where they had a much more restorative approach versus a punishment approach. But you are right, there have been times, especially in the Middle Ages, where restorative justice approaches have been misused or abused. But if you really look back at the history or the development of punishment, you find that every single society, every religion, in any kind of time, had much more restorative justice elements in it than more punitive elements. Like, to give you an example, like in Iran, where they still have today the death penalty, and in order to get off the hook, so to speak, and they really practice this, if just before an execution, and there's a nice video out on one case, the victim, or the father of the victim in this case, said, "I forgive you," the offender, then the execution is halted and the offender walks off free. And you find in many, many societies that they always have these loopholes. Like even with blood feuds, like in Albania, they always have special houses in Albania where when the offender flees to this house, he can stop a blood feud.
Yeah, well, Douglas Hay, who wrote about English criminal law in the Middle Ages out in
Okay, that's
He
great.
calls that the prerogative of mercy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's many ways to frame how discretion has been used.
Well, in Iraq, we just trace him down and blast him in the mosque.
Right.
Yeah, Jake.
I'm interested in the role of coercion in this process, because you kind of talked about it briefly, but in the two models that you had juxtaposed here, one building up from the base starts with a failure to make peace, which results in military action.
Yeah.
And the other is the result of a military action and an attempt to make peace after
Yeah,
that.
right.
In both cases, coercion is the central element
Absolutely.
in the process.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the role of coercion in the process and how that actually provides a way for people to actually get around these elements that sometimes they have to be pushed into that direction?
Well, that's one of the major debates right now in restorative justice is, can we or should we use coercion? And I remember when in the early writings in restorative justice, we always argue, replace the old traditional system completely with a restorative justice system where you don't need coercion anymore. And then soon we realized, what do you do with hardcore criminals who cannot be reached by be a nice guy and come and meet the victim and reconcile with the victim? And then people started to argue, we have to increase the pressure. It's an old Franz von Liszt model, a legal philosopher at the end of the 19th century, who argued you can reach the majority of the people fairly easily without much pressure or coercion. And then if it goes up in the pyramid, you need more and more and more. But I always, and I can buy into that system because I always argued that if you do that, you always offer restorative ways out. And Belgium, for instance, is a very good state where even in every prison in Belgium we have what is called a Restorative consultant, which means somebody who teaches the offenders about victims' needs, victims' rights, and victim compensation and restorative justice. And then if the offender says, I would like to reconcile with a victim, he arranges with an outside agency a mediation process between victim and offender. So I think you can build a restorative justice model on all levels. You always have to offer it as a way. But I think sometimes in order to protect the public, I would argue you have to incarcerate people. There's no way you can let them go free because they are too dangerous.
Since Jack opened it up, another problem I see with restorative justice, and I see this at the juvenile justice end, is that it's used coercively before there's any adjudication of delinquency. That it's viewed like other forms of diversion as a way of maintaining some sort of control, government giving some sort of sanction on the assumption that it's doing good. And that's before any kind of determination of guilt or innocence has been made. And that's a risk in terms of a lot of love. That it's all in the name of doing good when it can lead to all sorts of negative effects, net widening, Stan Cohen's visions of social control. I think has any more discussion developed in that the downside of coercive form of control in the name of doing good?
I don't think it's particular on the coercive aspect. I think, the problem is, I don't think the problem is when you have mediation going on, especially in the area of juvenile justice. The offender has to take over responsibility. That's what the framework we talk in about it. And I think if you look at outcomes for mediation, especially in the juvenile justice area, we find in Germany that 66% of the negotiated outcomes of a mediation process is a sincere apology by the offender to the victim. That's it. Victims very often don't want money, services, or whatever, or harsh punishments. They want a sincere apology, and they are happy with it. And I mean, if you haven't done it, I would just recommend go to some mediation processes, sit in as an observer. It's amazing what's going on between these parties. Because usually the victim comes in very angry, wants to know why me, why not my neighbor's house was burglarized, because I don't like him anyway.
Man of justice, eh?
Yeah. And then you see this process going on, and then when the offender then says, well, I offer you this, and then the victim says, well, how can you offer this? You have no means to fulfill your promises right now, because you don't have a job, you are in debt, and so why do you want to promise me these things which you cannot keep? And then slowly but surely they come to terms with each other. It's a very fascinating process.
Yeah, and I have it there. Some want to apology, they don't want to see him again.
Right. Yes?
What happens when you can't get through step one, the truth part? I mean, this idea of telling, truths. What happens in places where the truth is so incongruous that you can't come to a place where there's a common truth? And are there ways that you move to other steps to help get back to truth? Or, I mean, you could imagine in interethnic conflicts that there will be realities to people that will never be, they will never accept each other's truth.
Well, that's what you have in the Balkans right now, where you have all these different ethnic groups who cannot talk to each other, and that's why they have a problem. So I think you have to identify then ways how to get them together. You have to maybe get them together in smaller groups, what they did in Northern Ireland, where it was also hundreds of years of war and hatred between the Protestants and the Catholics. And when all the big things didn't work, they finally are right now down to very small groups who get together on weekends and where they tell their truths and their experiences. And it's just to teach them how to listen to other people's truths. And then also having the chance to tell their own truths and being heard. Those are very key components in the whole process. And then later you can grow bigger in the community, and maybe you can reconcile the community through peace circles or community peace circles, what they have a lot in Canada. I think the example John Braithwaite used in his speech in Nashville last week, in his Sutherland Award speech, was this community in Canada which was infested by abuse, child abuse and spouse abuse, and which reconciled through lots of circle meetings. They had meetings with circles for the victims, circles for the offenders, circles for the communities, and they included judicial people, prosecutors, judges, lawyers, and then finally they were able, and I've seen the video many times, of this particular community where in the first there's complete denial, no, nothing happened, we will not talk to you, and then they persistently work on these people and have these circles or whatever, and then finally you have to break this circle of resistance. That's the only way to do it. But if you cannot agree on a truth in a medium range, then you have a major problem, and I don't think you will achieve reconciliation at all, whatsoever, or peace.
Thinking about that, what is the role of fact in that process? I mean, talk about these as two fundamentally different things. Fact-finding and truth-finding in some ways are different things. So in terms of being empirical social scientists, what is the role that we can serve in terms of fact, bringing facts to this truth-finding process, or is there a role for us?
No, there's certainly a role for it, and I think they go hand in hand together, the truth-finding and the fact-finding. But you have to agree, at least you have to achieve a consensus on the facts, because otherwise you will never make the next step.
Well, it seems to me that some of these larger scale truth-telling, truth-advocation processes are really trying to amplify the facts. I mean, in some respects, a lot of the South African experience was built around not necessarily getting to any reconciliation or accountability. But
No,
first
no.
of all, just amplifying the fact.
The
There's
facts,
enough people
yeah.
out there to amplify the fact that this did happen and challenge that existing, prevailing fact that it didn't happen. But it
Right.
happened only because of the few rogue police officers in the South African police force.
Right.
So in some respects, it's really there to amplify truth first and fact later, or challenge facts with a kind of sense of moral truth telling.
Absolutely true. If you have seen some of the videos of South Africa, I mean, when you see Desmond Tutu, I mean, listening to all these different facts and truths, I mean, when he just basically collapses over his desk and he covers his face in disbelief what he's hearing there, because it's so painful sometimes even for outsiders, like he was an outsider definitely in the whole process. But it worked there that process worked quite well. And I mentioned before this mother who brought the killer of her killed daughter in South Africa, and they met in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission meetings, where he came and told his truth and she told her truth, and then they found it was not enough in the official commission work, and so they met afterwards privately and continued their dialogue. And then she was amazing, this mother. She learned then who was the commander who ordered the killing. Her daughter got shot in a bar. It was an attack on a bar where many people got killed. And then she tracked down the commander and she reconciled with him too. Yeah.
Why does it work? Maybe I didn't ask this very well when I first asked this, but why does this seem to work better in kind of post-Soviet Union countries? Because it seems like what you're saying, that it's not working well. It doesn't seem to be well received in post-communist society versus Africa or in North America. Why? In your opinion, why not?
Well, you have to take into account in South Africa the background of the people there, and religion plays a major role in South Africa also. And for instance, in the Balkans, in the post-Yugoslav societies, they don't have any, or religion doesn't play any major role. And they don't have any historical background which can rely on these reconciliatory measures.
Is it working in South Africa?
Oh, to a certain degree, yeah. Well, if you look at it from the criminal justice, or if you look at the incarceration rates before the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and now, or the criminal justice system, then it certainly was a failure, because right now South Africa has the third highest incarceration rate in the world, which they had before apartheid, and now in the new system as well. So then you might consider, like Dirk van Zyl Smith, he would argue, it was a failure, because he said the criminal justice system did not improve, it went down the tubes again. But that's again at which end you want to look.
And how about here? How about the evaluation here of restorative justice?
In the US, there's not very much going on here. I mean, even though Mark Albright from Minnesota, he's probably engaged in the more interesting projects in the US, because he works with the most serious offenders, something people had claimed could not be done before, and so he's very successful in his work. But other than that, there's not much going on in the US. It's very little.
I think that because we're such a culturally heterogeneous nation, that it would be much more difficult to implement than, to these other countries. And these other countries have had such a vast history of being oppressed, and, whether it's with former Yugoslavia, with communism, or Africa with the whole Europe's control over. America really hasn't had that. Only certain groups have, the Asians with the internment camps and Native Americans. But do you think that because of the diversity of this country that it would be more difficult to implement? Or do you think it's
No, I always identified the American problem as, because they always, as you know, you have to show success here very quickly if you implement a new program for juveniles in a justice court. So what they did in the 70s, and that was a big mistake of restorative justice, is they picked on first-time offenders, whites, and property offenders. And that was it. They didn't include minority groups, serious offenders. They always said, it doesn't work. And so, of course, after a while, and then they could show success. But then, of course, you could easily critique them. They are not really tackling the real cases in society, and that was a big failure of the United States restorative justice movement. But as I said, like Mark Albright also shows very clearly that it can be done in the worst cases, in homicide, where he works with parents of killed children and the offenders quite successfully.
I wonder if the bureaucratization of the U.S. criminal justice system also contributes to the unwillingness to adopt a new sort of paradigm, because it so challenges many of the existing government and non-governmental structures that are built around. I'm fascinated by your point about the incarceration rates in South Africa, because here too, post-emancipation, and then at the point some might call the end of the American apartheid, which was, you might say, the Civil Rights Act of 1965. These are major points at which rates of incarceration begin to peak. And so perhaps, restorative justice aside, criminal justice systems take on new kinds of social functions in the wake of the major historical transformation. More regulatory, become more central regulatory institutions, particularly prisons.
Could have been worse without restorative justice.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, by following.
Less apologizing, maybe. Well, yeah.
I can apologize when you have
Well, I think what I've seen in the Gordon Basemore and colleagues' approaches have always been small groups and less serious offenders.
Mm-hmm. Always, yeah.
So it's almost kind of a net widening experience to start off with. These are the least likely group to recidivate in the first place, and the harm has been least to the person who's on the other side of the
yeah, that's true.
schemata. And so the result has been largely an expectation of 95% success rate going into that mix, as opposed to Africa or South America or Central America, where genocide occurs across long periods of time, and the result is trying to restore just some sense of humanity in some of these communities, as opposed to whether my TV set gets returned or not.
Cool.
And I think that's just too.
Yeah.
The structure of the criminal justice system plays part in that. And then as somebody wants to implement a restorative justice program in the States, now they start to implement it, they're told, well, you can't put people at risk in the community, so now we have to refine it to the people who are at least risk. And say we can only do it in this small set of cases, and because the system's so effective in preventing risk.
Yeah, and also if you give the system like restorative justice as a maybe option, they never pick up on it. We experienced that in Germany, where we had laws allowing it, and then the prosecutors never took advantage of it. And then the courts are now went over to say, require the prosecutors, unless you have proven whether this case can go to victim-offender mediation, don't even show up in court. So now that they are required by the judges to look into an option of restorative justice, it becomes much more popular. But when you give let's say the prosecutors only an option, you say you may apply restorative justice measure in minor cases, they will never pick up on it. But if you make it mandatory by the law that they first look into it, then you will have a different result. As can be seen in New Zealand, where every crime has to go for a family group conferencing board. And they look into it, and only the most severe cases are sent to a traditional court or a judge, and the rest has to go to a family group conference.
Before determination?
Yeah. Well, the offender has to take over responsibility, which is basically saying, yes, I did it.
I got to repeat what Jeff said. Minor technicality.
Yeah.
Guilt or innocence. It's a major technicality.
Well, that's because they're convinced that this judicial system with a binary approach is how guilt or innocence is determined. And this argument is that guilt or innocence is not determined by the court. It's not determined by the decision of someone with legal authority.
But in New Zealand, if you go to a family group conferencing and the offender says, I didn't do it, that's the end of the conference. Then it goes to a traditional court which establishes then the evidence. Was it the person or wasn't it the person? So.
Right, and just like plea bargaining here, if I was a smart offender, I would agree
to do it, yeah.
If I was an innocent, streetwise person, I would agree to do it rather than go to court.
But I think that's something in restorative justice you always have to keep in mind. I mean, the offender has to take over the responsibility and has to volunteer to participate. Otherwise, like in Germany, we do look into it. Otherwise, it never happens. Also, if the victim doesn't want to participate, that's the end of the story. Both parties have to agree.
But I guess what you're following up on Simon's point, one question is, if they agree and they come to some sort of a resolution, how does the justice system then handle that person? Is it a person that would have a criminal record of a conviction in the States, or is it some other record, or no record?
In most states, no record.
And then some of the net widening concern you have, Simon, if it becomes a civil or non-criminal record, then it doesn't deal with stigma and label, so it may not, there is a record. Well, what we're saying in some countries there isn't.
Well, in this country, it's a noted diversion.
That may be something you might want to address.
What do we know about recidivism of these groups?
Well, it depends on where you look.
We pick the rock.
Well, if you look at the research done by Sherman and Strang in Australia at the RISE project, they have lower recidivism rates.
And? Just to finish there.
No, I don't know about higher recidivism rates. I mean, as Lode Walgraver always says, he hasn't seen any study which can report that there is in the end a higher recidivism rate. And you can argue that way, if it's not making things not worse in terms of recidivism, why not go for it? Because it betters the situation of victims tremendously. Because if you look at satisfaction rates of people involved, they are very high. It doesn't matter which model you apply or in which country you look. Victims and offenders and involved parties are usually very happy with the outcomes, most of the times. And with the recidivism, as I said, there's slight evidence that it's lower. But it's certainly, if you want to measure it, by recidivism, you wouldn't be able to say this is a great success story. It's not.
But neither are the others.
No. Cool.
Well, I think that's really the argument upon which these interventions are built, that absent the ability to affect recidivism directly, affecting the affect around it, which is the relationship between the victim community and the offender, might be more important, given that these other things don't seem to make a difference. Well, it looks like we're coming to there's a whole group of folks who I think are going off to teach some classes at the moment. I'd like to thank a couple of people. I'd like to thank Lisa Bailey for organizing these meetings for us. Thank you very much, Lisa. And I'd like to thank our filming person here from WGBH, who's one of our PBS stations in the greater Boston area. Do I have that right, I hope?
Yes, you do.
Okay, I thought I did. And most important, I'd like to thank Elmar Weitekamp for a very engaging discussion of the application of this criminological model to some larger sets of political ideas. So thank you very much, Elmar.
Well, thank you.